Hello. The next piece that I have on my pottery throwdown challenge is a cylindrical cup with a ribbed outside that was submitted by Sophia Sotelo. So it's called a ribbed conical bowl. Okay. Um, it's made in the United Kingdom, so just from an aesthetic standpoint, it's got a fairly narrow base. So I don't know how much of a bowl it would be. Normally your bowl, as you think about it, it's got a little wider base, but if that's what it was called, then that's what it is. So nonetheless, here we go. Thank you, Sophia, for challenging me to make a ribbed conical bowl. I might make it a little more cylindrical so you can see the ribs, but that's what we're going to make today. So, with my ball of clay placed in the middle of the bat, so I get that going. Get my wheel to full speed. My hands wet, so I can effectively cone and center. The ball of clay stuck. Cone it up a couple of times. Center it back down. Cone it up once more. Center it back down. So as I like to make note of in the videos I'm creating as an instructional tool, is the coning and centering process is there primarily for two reasons. In this scenario, I happen to be working with pugged, which is another term for recycled clay. This was once clay that was used for hand building, and we took the scraps and we put it back through the pug mill and added a little bit of water and mixed it all together and pugged it back into a large diameter coil, if you will. So the coning and centering process helps the potter to ensure that the piece of clay that he or she is working with is uniform throughout. So the other advantage of coning and centering, actually kind of the requirement of coning and centering, is to get a piece of clay so it is centered. It's perfectly in the middle of the bat, and it works, it spins perfectly. It's kind of like a tire that's got the right amount of air pressure. Everything works as it should. There's nothing going to be off balance. So now that I have my piece of clay centered, and I have it a comfortable size that I'm going to work with to make this object, I'm going to put a little water on, and now I go through the next steps. The next step in the sequence is to hole out the clay. There are different techniques that can be used for this step. I prefer using my ring and middle finger of my left hand when I work with smaller pieces of clay such as this. When I work with larger pieces of clay, making large platters or bowls, I change up my technique and I use my thumbs. I go in the middle like this. Okay? I've even been known to use a knuckle or even an elbow. So once I've holed it out, and the process there is to make up an opening right down the middle, so that ideally you have an equal amount of clay on all sides of that center piece. Once you're comfortable with the hole, now you go through the process of opening. So now we're taking the clay and we're opening up that inside diameter, making it larger inside, moving the clay to the outside wall as we do this. Part of this process also involves compressing the bottom. Depending upon the clay that one is working with, compression is a good thing to do. It's not necessary with all clays or with all throwing techniques, but I've learned that it's just a good practice to have. So I pretty much compress in everything that I do. So there we have that. So once I'm comfortable with my inside diameter, then I'm going to begin pulling. And I'm pulling from the outside. So I make a little groove at the bottom. I'm going to get 2 fingers in the groove, and that's with my right hand doing the work, and my left hand is there as a guide. And I'm going to pull that clay upward a little bit, slow it down a little more, make another groove, and again, my right hand is doing the majority of the work. My left hand is there as a guide. You can see how as I pull the clay upward and I come back and compress, but the clay moves from the bottom up. The wall gets not only taller, but it also gets thinner. So as I work to create my ideal piece in this case, I'm keeping in perspective that this particular piece has a fairly small diameter base to it. So I'm going to start working in a manner that allows me to achieve that very thing, smaller diameter base. So when you're pulling, you have the advantage of making the most efficient use out of all of the clay that you have in front of you. If you're going to leave the wall really thick, that's a choice, but then you're not really using the clay to its potential. So in the grand scheme of things, I probably leave my walls a little bit thicker than a lot of potters might, but I like to think of most of my work as utilitarian or functional, and if it's going to be used, I never have an idea of who would be using it. So to that end, I like to make the wall thick enough so that no matter who is using it, they're not going to be apt to break it. So kind of now that I have the wall about where I want it to be, I'm going to use my wood modeling tool, and I'm going to use this beveled edge of it so that I can trim out a little bit here at the bottom. Trimming out a little clay at the bottom, I'm able to clean up my pot, make the base a little smaller in diameter. I don't want to go too much. Now, what I also want to do before I start making the ribs, or the ribs that are on the outside, is I want to go ahead and use an actual rib, and I'm going to clean and smooth that outer wall so it's a little more uniform. And this prepares that outer wall for the texturing that I'm about to do. So what I'm going to do is, with that wood modeling tool, I'm going to work that to create just some grooves, some shelves. So, and I want to do this slowly, but I want to be able to use just the tip of that tool. Maybe I have one that's a little bit sharper. Okay. That one's better. See that? It's got a little bit of a sharper edge to it. Okay, that sharper edge is going to help me create these ribs on the outside of the pot. Now, another technique that I could incorporate is actually to wait for the pot to dry a little bit and actually trim . So for the sake of the video, I'm going to have to create this now. So I'll take a look at it, see if I like it. So when the clay is soft, it doesn't necessarily create grooves or ribs as well as when the clay is a little bit firmer. So that being said, once the clay is a little bit stiffer, once it's closer to leather hard, it's a little bit easier to manipulate, but you can see that the texture and the ribs have actually been created. It's not an exact match to the one that Sophia shared with me, but you get the idea of how those ribs are created. And once that clay is a little bit stiffer, then that will trim up and clean up very nicely. So I think for right now what I have is it's a little bit narrower in scope than what I'd like. So what I can do now is just kind of as one last finishing touch, I'm just going to use my wood modeling tool again because it's long enough. And with that tool being wet, I'm just going to use that on the inside and gently open the wall of my vessel a little bit so that it has a bit more of a bowl shape rather than a cylinder. So you can see how I opened that up a little bit. Make sure that all my water is mopped up. It has a little bit more of a bowl shape to it at this point, as is described in the title that was submitted by Sophia. Is a ribbed conical bowl. Okay, so ribbed is the texture, conical is the shape, bowl is what it might be used for. So I think if you look at it, there we have a ribbed conical bowl. So looks somewhat like that. Doesn't have to be exact. Okay. So, but I'll clean it up a little bit later on. Thank you, Sophia, for submitting that as a challenge.